This is Auckland Airport in New Zealand, where flights are packed with passengers leaving, not for holidays, but to start new lives abroad. Between January and June 2024, 80,000 New Zealand citizens, 1.5% of the population, left the country, the highest on record. For every returning New Zealander, 3 depart, many bound for Australia or the UK. Most are young workers, escaping an economy plagued by soaring housing costs, falling wages, and rising unemployment. These departures come as unemployment edges up by 1% and economic growth stagnates. Once praised for its resilience, New Zealand now faces a population crisis and economic stagnation. It's a country that, from the outside, many see as a relative paradise. So what forces are now pushing an entire generation to abandon the country they once called home? Well, New Zealand's economic struggles begin with its over-reliance on 2 industries: tourism and agriculture. Tourism accounted for 14% of the country's entire GDP before the pandemic and employed 8.4% of the workforce, making it an important part of the economy. Back in 1999, New Zealand essentially branded itself and started a marketing campaign with the slogan 100% Pure, promoting the country's natural beauty and outdoor activities, complete with bikers enjoying views of mountains, kayaking, paddling, and for some reason a piano on a beach. The Lord of the Rings movies helped too. The annual tourist influx to New Zealand grew 40%, from 1.8 million in 2000 to 2.4 million in 2006, attributed in large part to the Lord of the Rings phenomenon. For a country with a population of just over 5 million, that's a lot of extra people. Between 2007 and 2008, it's estimated over 1 billion people saw some kind of 100% pure marketing, either in print, television, or online. It became one of the world's most effective marketing strategies. However, this dependency on tourism left the nation vulnerable when global travel came to a halt. Tourist numbers have since rebounded to 84% of pre-pandemic levels, but the recovery is fragile. The government's recent decision to triple the visitor tax from 35 New Zealand dollars to 100 has sparked concerns among industry leaders, with fears it may deter travelers further. This measure aims to fund conservation and infrastructure projects, but it reflects deeper systematic issues. How to sustain a tourism-based economy when its primary draw, the environment, is under threat. Agriculture, meanwhile, contributes over 5% of the GDP, the highest it's ever been. It's long been another economic cornerstone, but the sector's reliance on foreign workers expose it to shocks. Migrant labor, which once accounted for 20% of the agricultural workforce, dwindled during the pandemic, leading to unharvested crops and financial losses. For example, in the kiwi fruit industry alone, the labor shortage meant that approximately 20% of crops went unharvested, resulting in financial losses estimated in the millions of dollars. At the same time, the government's sustainability policies aimed at reducing agriculture's environmental impacts have imposed additional costs on farmers. These policies are good for the environment, for sure, and they include things like cutting biogenic methane emissions by 10% by 2030 and up to 47% by 2050, compared to 2017 levels. But to achieve this, farmers are required to adopt emissions-reducing technologies, which often involve significant upfront investments and can make it tough for farmers to be competitive in global markets. These vulnerabilities are compounded by government austerity measures. Following the economic downturn that started in 2022, the centre-right National Party that was elected in 2023 initiated widespread public sector cuts and reduced spending to control debt. But there were some negative side effects. Public healthcare, for example, saw funding cuts that stretched hospitals to their limits, increasing wait times and reducing available staff in critical areas. In education, capital investment for school infrastructure projects was delayed or cancelled, leaving a lot of schools operating under substandard conditions. Transport and infrastructure were also hit, with delays in road maintenance and a scaling back of planned projects under something called the National Land Transport Fund. The broader economic symptoms are grim. Unemployment rose to 4.7% in mid-2024, and the economy contracted for 4 of the last 5 quarters. Annual growth remains stagnant at 0.2%, while interest rates have surged to over 5% in an attempt to slow inflation. You see, in New Zealand's case, inflation climbed above 7% in 2022, well above the Reserve Bank of New Zealand's target range of 1 to 3%. So, to basically cool the economy, the Reserve Bank increased interest rates, which makes borrowing, things like taking out loans and mortgages, more expensive. This discourages spending and investment, helping to reduce demand for goods and services, which in turn slows price increases. This affects jobs because businesses face higher costs for loans, which makes it harder to expand or invest in new projects. This can slow job creation or lead to layoffs, which is part of the reason why a record 80,200 citizens left in the year ending June 2024, a 70% increase from pre-pandemic figures. Many of these immigrants are young professionals, driven abroad by rising costs and a lack of economic opportunities. But to really understand what's going wrong with New Zealand's economy, we have to go back to the 1980s. The fourth Labour government, led by Prime Minister David Lang and Finance Minister Roger Douglas, came to power during a crisis. The country was drowning in debt, inflation was rampant, and years of heavy-handed economic controls under Prime Minister Robert Muldoon had stalled growth. The government's solution came to be known as Rogernomics, a radical, market-driven transformation of the nation's economy inspired by Reaganomics in the United States and Thatcherism in the United Kingdom. What followed was nothing short of a revolution. State subsidies that had propped up industries like agriculture and forestry were pulled overnight, forcing businesses to adapt or fail. The financial markets were deregulated, foreign exchange and interest rate controls scrapped, and the New Zealand dollar was floated, meaning that its value was no longer fixed by the government but determined by supply and demand in the global currency markets. Public enterprises, from telecommunications to banking, were corporatized and prepared for sale. These moves were billed as necessary to modernize a stagnant economy, but their impact would be felt far beyond the balance sheets. Taxes were restructured in ways that reshaped society. A new goods and services tax was introduced, while the top income tax rate was slashed from 66% to 48%. Inflation dropped into single digits, but unemployment surged as traditional industries like manufacturing and agriculture buckled under the pressure. By the end of the decade, New Zealand was the only industrialized nation in the world to record negative GDP growth in 1989, as the economy entered a prolonged recession. The speed and scope of these reforms were pretty unprecedented. Douglas and his allies in the Treasury operated with near absolute power, leveraging the parliamentary majority to bypass dissent. Public input was largely ignored. Critics later described this as an elected dictatorship, where sweeping changes were imposed without a clear democratic mandate. The long-term consequences were equally dramatic. Chronic underinvestment in infrastructure and public services became evident as the years went on. While the government boasted about creating a leaner, more efficient state, the cuts came at a cost. New Zealand's productivity, measured as GDP per hour worked, slipped quite dramatically. In the 1970s, New Zealand's workers produced about the same amount per hour as workers in the 38 countries that make up the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. Today, they produce 20% less per hour compared to the middle-ranked OECD countries. What Rogernomics achieved wasn't just an economic restructuring, but a complete ideological shift. It entrenched the belief that markets could solve nearly every problem. Governments that followed, regardless of political alignment, accepted this framework. Even now, efforts to reverse the effects of privatization or rebuild public investment face opposition rooted in this legacy. New Zealand's economy became more open, but the costs were quite evident. Inequality grew, critical services faltered, industries that once provided stable jobs disappeared. What began as a promise of prosperity ended as a story of rapid reform. And while the country still had a relatively strong social safety net compared to a lot of other countries, definitely weakened. Within this came something called the Employment Contracts Act of 1991, which transformed the labor market. This legislation replaced decades of union-driven collective bargaining with individual employment contracts, fundamentally altering how workers negotiated pay and conditions. Employers could now bypass unions, dealing directly with employees. While framed as a move towards flexibility and efficiency, the ECA marked a dramatic shift in workplace power dynamics. Union membership collapsed in the years following its introduction. In 1991, 43% of workers were unionized. By 1999, that figure had plummeted to 21.7%. This wasn't a gradual decline. It was a deliberate dismantling of collective labor power. Workers faced greater risks. Strikes became rare, and employers gained substantial leverage in determining wages and conditions. Performance-based contracts and variable hours became common, providing employers with flexibility but leaving workers exposed to instability. The effects on wages were quite striking. Before the ECA, labor's share of New Zealand's income was relatively stable. After its introduction, this share began a steep decline. Unions lost power, and workers had to negotiate contracts individually, making it harder to get pay raises. By 2023, wages accounted for a historically low proportion of national income, reflecting decades of suppressed earnings growth. What made up for that share drop was operation surpluses and returns to capital. Basically, lower wages with higher business profits. For workers, this meant fewer resources for essentials and increased reliance on secondary jobs. The ECA's influence extended beyond wages though. Its emphasis on cost-cutting discouraged investments in productivity-enhancing industries. Businesses, particularly in agriculture and tourism, leaned on low-cost labor instead of adopting technologies or strategies that could increase output per worker. These industries, already central to New Zealand's economy, became even more entrenched as the main drivers of growth. While agriculture and tourism brought in revenue, their low productivity made it difficult for the country to keep pace with global competitors focused on high-value sectors like technology and advanced manufacturing. At the same time, casual and part-time work surged. Employers took advantage of the Act's provisions to expand non-standard employment arrangements. Non-standard employment arrangements being things like gig work, fixed-term contracts, and seasonal work. This inadvertently contributed to more immigration being needed. While this allowed businesses to adapt to demand fluctuations, it also meant less job security and fewer benefits for workers. The shift to a precarious labor market widened income inequality, creating a growing divide between stable, high-income earners and a vulnerable, underpaid workforce. The ECA was introduced during a period of sweeping economic reforms, but its impact on labor relations is quite unique. It didn't simply create a more flexible labor market. It restructured the economy to prioritize short-term efficiency over long-term resilience. By cutting wage growth and shifting risks onto workers, the Act left New Zealand reliant on industries that couldn't generate sustainable, high-value growth. The Employment Contracts Act also created the conditions for New Zealand's housing crisis to take root. Wage suppression and labor market deregulation shifted economic behavior. With diminished incomes, workers had less purchasing power, while businesses, focused on cost-cutting rather than productivity, funneled resources into safer, more profitable investments like real estate. As wages stagnated, home ownership became less attainable for the average worker, transforming housing into a commodity rather than a shelter. Between 2000 and 2021, inflation-adjusted house prices in New Zealand rose 256%, compared to much lower increases in countries like the United States with 64% and the United Kingdom with 110%. A series of policy decisions during and after the ECA's implementation made housing investment particularly lucrative. The government didn't tax profits made from selling property, and zoning rules made it easier to buy and develop land. This encouraged investors to focus on property, driving up housing prices as people competed to make money from real estate. People and businesses stopped putting their money into areas like technology and manufacturing that could improve productivity. Instead, they focused on housing because it was the easiest and most reliable way to make a profit. This shift had cascading effects on New Zealand's economy. By 2022, housing affordability had plummeted, with rents and mortgages consuming 30% or more of disposable income for 46% of renters, a figure that had been 19% in the 1980s. As property prices soared, construction costs became another bottleneck. Local councils didn't have enough money to improve infrastructure, which made it harder to develop land. This led to cities spreading out and land prices going up, making housing even less affordable in New Zealand. The labor market, weakened by the ECA, became entwined with the housing crisis. With wages unable to match the spiraling cost of living, critical industries struggled to retain workers. Professionals left in record numbers, Businesses, facing labor shortages, turned to low-cost immigrant workers. This influx placed additional strain on urban infrastructure, transport, water systems, and schools, already struggling to accommodate rising populations. Yet these challenges were never met with sufficient investment. Instead, resources continued to pour into speculative housing. Housing inequality deepened as home ownership declined. Between 1986 and 2013, home ownership had fallen from 74% to 65%, with over 1% of the population living in severe housing deprivation. Homeless families crowded into cars and motels, and emergency housing costs ballooned to $4 billion annually, a number that has doubled since 2017. The housing crisis illustrates how interconnected economic forces shape national policy outcomes. What began with suppressed wages has spiraled into a self-reinforcing loop. Unaffordable housing drives migration, weakens productivity, and strains infrastructure. As New Zealand remains locked in this cycle, the housing market, once seen as a refuge, has become the single largest obstacle to New Zealand's economic recovery. But New Zealand's economic challenges go even deeper. They're rooted in structural weaknesses that leave the country struggling to keep pace with the modern world. One of the clearest indicators is research and development. In 2019, New Zealand allocated 1.47% of their GDP to R&D, ranking 26th out of the 38 OECD countries. Compare that to South Korea, where 4.5% drives technological innovation, or Israel, where similar levels of investment fuel a booming tech industry. For New Zealand, this lack of commitment has meant fewer breakthroughs. It stagnated industrial growth and led to an inability to develop competitive, high-value sectors that could really help diversify the economy. The issue is made even worse by the fact that New Zealand depends pretty much completely on Australia as a primary trading partner. While proximity makes Australia an obvious choice, it also highlights a missed opportunity to diversify trade relationships. The UK, with its integration into the EU for decades, built trade networks across Europe. Canada leverages its access to the US, the world's largest economy, to grow its industries. New Zealand, by contrast, sends agricultural goods to Australia, relying on a narrow export base that leaves it vulnerable to market disruptions. Everything is more expensive due to its geographical isolation. What this also means is that shipping costs are high, while the small domestic market limits economies of scale. One of the ways to measure this is through something called purchasing power parity, an economic measure that compares the cost of living between countries by determining how much money is needed to buy the same goods and services in different places. When comparing New Zealand to other Western countries, it's significantly lower. Domestically, New Zealand's small market creates more barriers to progress. With just 5.2 million people, it lacks the scale needed for major industrial expansion. Businesses struggle to justify investments in productivity-enhancing technologies or workforce development when consumer demand is inherently capped. As a result, many industries stick to traditional, low-cost models, reinforcing the country's reliance on agriculture and tourism. These sectors contribute to the economy but do little to close the productivity gap with global leaders. These pressures ripple across society. Talented young professionals leave for better prospects abroad, draining the workforce of its future leaders. Infrastructure lags behind, unable to meet the demands of a growing, urbanizing population. Public services, dependent on a thriving economy, face funding shortages, leaving health and education systems overstretched. The result is a cycle that feeds on itself. Low productivity limits growth, which curtails investment, leaving the country unable to break free from its constraints. So, what can be done? Well, New Zealand's economy can't rely on the past. Tourism and agriculture, while essential, have limits. Diversification is a must. The government has begun increasing funding for research and development, offering grants to tech startups and expanding partnerships between universities and businesses. Like I mentioned earlier, the country spends 1.47% of GDP on R&D, way behind leaders like South Korea, which allocates 4.5%. To close this gap, new tax incentives and funding for green technology could bring New Zealand closer to being a hub for innovation rather than simply a producer of raw exports. The housing crisis also needs to be addressed. Decades of underinvestment and speculative property buying have left home ownership out of reach for many. Policies like the Unitary Plan in Auckland have started to allow greater housing density, while the government has ramped up state housing construction after years of neglect. Housing initiatives, including tax reforms on property speculation, are slowly cooling the market, with prices in some areas falling by up to 9%. However, the pace of change must accelerate. Public housing projects need better funding, and urban zoning laws require further relaxation to unlock the supply needed to meet growing demand. In terms of workforce, New Zealand has to put a stop on the brain drain of their next generation. Creating high-value jobs domestically is the only way to stem this tide. Investment in the green economy offers a possible solution. Projects like Air New Zealand's adoption of sustainable aviation fuels and the rollout of electric vehicle infrastructure show the country's potential to lead in low-carbon technologies. By expanding ecotourism, electrifying transport, and supporting sustainable agriculture, New Zealand can create jobs that align with its 100% pure brand while attracting global talent. The green economy looks set to redefine New Zealand's future. The global market for green technologies is expected to reach $5.3 trillion by 2030, and New Zealand is uniquely positioned to lead. Its abundant renewable energy resources could power industries like green data centers, which Amazon and Microsoft have already started investing in. Sustainable food production, leveraging the country's natural assets, could dominate export markets if paired with aggressive R&D into emissions reduction. These opportunities require bold action. Without them, the country risks remaining trapped in a cycle of low productivity and declining global relevance, a position that no country wants to be in. Only time will tell if New Zealand, like many other Anglosphere countries such as Canada, Australia, and Ireland, will fix this economy crisis they have. Thank you for watching.